In this lesson, we'll learn how to add state to our class-based React components. As a reminder, state is simply data that changes over time. And the beautiful part about React is that it will re-render a component whenever a piece of that component's state changes. So state is a really good solution whenever you have something that's going to change, right, over the course of the component's existence. So let me give you an example right now in our current project. As I mentioned, we ultimately want our user form to support two different modes, a login mode and a registration mode. And we want the header in each mode right here to vary. We want the user to see a different piece of text depending on the form version that they are in. And that can change back and forth as the user toggles the eventual switch at the top of the form. So they may be in registration mode and see one bit of text, then they'll go into login mode and see another piece of text, and then they might switch back to the registration mode and see the original piece of text. And that is a perfect example of some piece of data, in this case the text, that is changing over time. It's not static. It's not just a hard-coded thing like welcome, right? If you have something that is always going to be constant, that is never going to change, then there's no reason to use state. State is precisely for those situations where you have something that is going to change over time or be updated over time. It can be anything. It can be a string. It can be a number. It can be a Boolean that reflects some kind of status. It can be an array or an object. It doesn't matter what the data type is. What matters is that that data type is going to inform some segment of the UI, and that data is going to change over time, and we want the UI to update automatically whenever that piece of state changes. And that is the problem that React components and state solve. They help solve updating the UI whenever data changes that is related to the component. And we're going to see more of the use cases as we explore the syntax over the course of the next couple of lessons. In this lesson, I want to show you the basic syntax for declaring some bit of component state. In order to do that, we're going to need to begin with a constructor method in the body of our class component. So right here, I'm going to add a specific method called constructor. And as a reminder, if you are unfamiliar with traditional JavaScript, this is not a React-specific idea. This is a general JavaScript class-based idea. The constructor method is run automatically whenever an object is made from this class. So in the React ecosystem, the equivalent of instantiating an object from a class is rendering a component from this app component class. So this will run whenever we render app, which we are clearly doing once in the app, in our application, and that's why we're seeing it on the right-hand side. So the constructor method will run once whenever we create a new app object or equivalently a new app component. So this constructor is actually going to receive props as a first parameter. And the first thing you're going to do whenever you're declaring state and you're declaring this constructor method is to call super and pass in props. Okay. Now, the reason you need to do this is because this is the syntax that's going to enable this.props to work. We saw how in the previous lesson, we can access props via the this keyword, and that is going to work if you don't have a constructor. But if you're manually writing a constructor method, what you're actually doing is overriding the superclass's constructor method, which is the React component class's constructor method, and you're actually breaking some of the initialization that the React developers built for you with things like props. And so it's very important that if we're overriding that constructor, we need to make sure to tell JavaScript and React to run the original constructor method in the component superclass that app is inheriting from. And the super keyword does that, and it also passes the props up there. The key takeaway without getting too technical and object-oriented is we're going to lose key component functionalities such as props if we don't use this syntax. So within our constructor method, you're always going to call super and pass in props. Keep in mind, I may have forgotten to mention this explicitly a minute or two ago, but you only want to add this constructor method if you're actually going to provide the component with state. And a component does not need to have any kind of state. All of the functional components that we've built previously throughout the course didn't have any form of state. So it's not a requirement because your component can just be a bunch of static JSX. But over time, it's likely that some components will need data that changes over time. So if you are declaring state in a class component, then you need a constructor method. And if you have a constructor method within a React component body, then you need to call super props, and that is critical. So this is some sort of like the housekeeping work or the requirements we have to do just to be able to work with state. All right. If you don't need state, then don't worry about the constructor. If you do need state, declare it and invoke super, passing in props, which you're going to get as the first argument to the constructor method. All right. Then here's the part where we actually declare state. What we're going to do is we're going to reference this.state. And we're going to assign whatever state we want to this component. So this can be a number, it can be a string, it can be whatever you want. But the most common thing you're typically going to see is an object with properties, because it's likely that your component will have multiple pieces of state. And in order to assign a name to those pieces of data, the object represents the best data structure for that, because each property name could be a name for that slice of state, and the value can be whatever we want. So in this object, we can obviously store values that are strings and numbers and booleans and arrays, and then that whole object represents the complete component state. So this state will be created every time that we render an app component, and the state will belong exclusively to the one component that is being instantiated. So what I mean by that is it's not going to escape the boundaries of the component that it is within. So for example, if we create 3 app components, all 3 of those app components will have their own independent component state. It is not going to be shared between those different app components, those 3 different app instances, right? They're all independent. We're specifying what each app component will have whenever it is created, whenever it is instantiated, or in other words, whenever it is rendered to the screen. So in here, let's say we're going to have a single piece of state, and I'm going to call that property text. And I'm going to say the value is going to be login into account. So you can almost think of this as saying, this is some bit of data that is now going to live within our app component, right? And we are welcome to do whatever we want with it in regards to the UI. Right now, there's no way to change this data, but the fact remains we have this piece of data living on the app component. It's an object with a text property set to a string, okay? There's a very, very important note that I want to make sure you remember here and memorize, and that is you should only use the this.state syntax and an equal sign in the constructor. So as I mentioned, the whole point of state is that it's going to change over time, and I'm going to show you how to change it in upcoming lessons, but you never want to change it by using the this.state syntax again, ever again, except for the constructor. And the reason for that is if you use this.state in any other place besides the constructor with the equal sign, that will not trigger a component re-render. And the whole point is whenever we update state, we do want React to rerun the render method and give us the next iteration, the next version of the component. So there is a specific protocol in React to update state. So this equal syntax should only be used for state initialization, for the first draft, for the first version of the state, which should always be in your constructor method. So this syntax right here, remember, never do this except for in the constructor method. This is only for your initial state, for the first version of that data that is going to live within the component. All right. Once we declare this.state, we are welcome to use it in any other of our component methods. So for example, in render, we can access it directly here. And much like we accessed this.props, we similarly access this.state to get access to whatever the state is, in this case, our object, and we can use any of those state properties as we'd like. Keep in mind, if that state updates, then the render method will rerun, and that will allow our dynamic reference to update the component. So for example, right here, rather than hard-coding login into account, I know this is something on the button that will eventually change depending on the mode that the user is in. So that's something really nice to have in our state, because if I reference this.state.text here, I know that as the text property on our state changes, React will force a re-render, which we can make this be the most up-to-date text that we want to present to the user. When the user is in login mode, we can show them the text as it currently is, which is login to account. But if we change the text piece of state to register, then React will re-render, and then this will be replaced, of course, with the most up-to-date value of the text property, which will be registered. So every time the state updates, the JSX will update because the render method will rerun, and that allows us, of course, to inject that dynamic changing content, that dynamic changing data into our UI. Obviously, it doesn't have to be only visual for the user, but in this case, it will be. And there's other use cases where we can use a state, which again is just changing data over time in order to modify and update our UI. Okay, Much like props, because this is an object, we are welcome to destructure from it. So for example, instead of this approach, which is rendering the state to the screen right here, more specifically the text property of the state, I can also do a syntax like this. I can destructure the text property from this.state, which is a JavaScript object, which allows me to simply render the text value right here in line, and we're going to be able to see that. Once again, we do need curly braces in this case because that is the JavaScript evaluation syntax. If we left off the curly braces, we would simply see the hard-coded text, T-E-X-T on the screen. We don't want that. We want the dynamic value of the text property. And whatever that is at any given moment on the state is what we're going to display in this case in the button text. And that's what makes this so powerful, is changes over time will update the UI. We're going to see more of this as we continue proceeding throughout the remaining lessons. Okay, so this has been a pretty complex lesson, so very quickly, let's recap everything we learned. If you are declaring state within a class-based React component, you need to declare a constructor method. That constructor method will accept your props, and you need to make sure to call super props. Basically, it's going to be the very first thing in your constructor method. This will pretty much always be here whenever you are using state. Then you do this.state equals, and you only use that syntax once in your component. It should only be on the constructor. And then, of course, you can assign state to be whatever you want. Usually, it's going to be an object. And once you define it, then you are welcome to use this.state in any of your components or classes instance methods. So any other method like render, you can access this.state and do something with it, such as render a piece of it to the screen, which we are doing right now with the text property. All right, so we're just getting started. Lots more on state in the upcoming lessons, and I will see you there.